The year is 1798. The Mediterranean Sea, once the cradle of empires, has become a theatre of war. To the north, the French Republic, fueled by revolutionary fire and the genius of a young general Napoleon Bonaparte, dominates the continent. To the west, the Kingdom of Great Britain stands isolated, her naval power the only shield against invasion. But the war is shifting south, towards the ancient trade routes that link Europe to the riches of the East. In the centre of this maritime chessboard lies a small, sun-scorched archipelago, a fortress of honey-coloured limestone rising sheer from the azure depths. Malta. For centuries, Malta had been more than an island, it was a weapon. Controlled by the Knights Hospitaller, an ancient order of warrior monks, its grand harbour was the envy of every admiral in Europe. The fortifications of Valletta were legendary, a complex network of bastions, cavaliers, and curtain walls designed to withstand the apocalypse. To hold Malta was to hold the lock of the Mediterranean. To lose it was to leave the door to Egypt, and ultimately the British jewel of India, wide open. In the early summer of 1798, the horizon off the coast of Malta turned white with canvas. It was a sight that would have frozen the blood of any defender. The French Armada had arrived. This was not a raiding party, it was an imperial migration. Hundreds of transport ships, escorted by 13 ships of the line, carried the Army of the Orient. Nearly 40,000 battle-hardened soldiers destined for the sands of Egypt. But before they could march on the pyramids, Napoleon needed a secure base. He needed the lock. The Knights of St. John, once the scourge of the Ottoman navy, were now a shadow of their former glory. Their Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch, presided over an order fractured by internal politics and French intrigue. When Napoleon demanded entry to the harbour to water his fleet and was refused, the response was swift and devastating. The French general did not need to lay a protracted siege to the impregnable walls. He used a weapon far more effective than cannon fire: psychological shock and speed. French troops landed at multiple points along the coast, sweeping aside the disorganized resistance of the Knights' militia. Within hours, the countryside was ablaze, and the French tricolour was advancing on the fortified cities. Inside Valletta, panic reigned. French knights within the order refused to fight their countrymen, and the Maltese population, sensing the weakness of their rulers, clamoured for surrender to avoid a massacre. The impossible fortifications, built to hold out for years, fell in days. On the 12th of June, 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte walked through the gates of Valletta. As he toured the massive defensive works, inspecting the deep ditches and towering walls, one of his generals remarked that it was lucky there was someone inside to open the gates for them, for they would never have entered otherwise. It was a masterstroke of strategic decisiveness. In one sweep, France had secured the most vital naval base in the region. With the Knights expelled and the island under French administration, Napoleon wasted no time. He garrisoned the island with 4,000 elite troops under the command of General Claude-Henri Belgrand de Vaubois, a staunch Republican and capable officer. Then, leaving behind the blueprint for a new, enlightened French Malta, Napoleon sailed for Egypt, confident that his rear was secure. The French position seemed unassailable. They held the harbour, the forts, the gunpowder, and the high ground. The British Royal Navy, stretched thin and operating thousands of miles from home, had no presence on the island and no army to land. To the casual observer, the game was over. The lock had been changed and the key was in French pockets. But history often pivots on the smallest of miscalculations. Napoleon had conquered the stone fortresses, but he had failed to conquer the people living in their shadow. He had assumed that the Maltese were merely peasants to be governed, not a variable in the equation of war. It was an error that would transform an easy conquest into a nightmare of isolation and endurance. The French occupation, initiated with such clinical precision, began to unravel with clumsy arrogance. Napoleon had promised respect for the Maltese religion and property, but the reality of supporting a massive garrison and funding a distant war dictated otherwise. The French administration, desperate for gold and silver, turned their eyes toward the island's churches. In the fiercely Catholic heart of Malta, this was not merely taxation, it was sacrilege. Throughout the sweltering summer of 1798, the atmosphere on the island thickened with resentment. The dismantling of the Knights' institutions had stripped many Maltese of their livelihoods, and now the systematic looting of their sanctuaries pushed the population to the breaking point. The spark finally ignited on a Sunday, the 2nd of September, in the ancient capital of Medina. When French officials arrived to auction off the tapestries of a Carmelite church, the simmering anger of the crowd boiled over into violence. It was not a military maneuver, it was an explosion of rage. The small French detachment in Medina was overwhelmed by a mob armed with nothing more than farming tools, stones, and antiquated muskets hidden away in cellars. The garrison commander was thrown from a balcony, his death signaling the end of passive submission. Within 24 hours, the fires of rebellion had spread from the silent streets of the old capital to the bustling villages surrounding the Grand Harbour. General Vaubois, safe behind the massive walls of Valletta, looked out to see the countryside rising against him. He was a veteran soldier, and he recognized immediately that his position in the open terrain was untenable against a hostile population of thousands. He made the cold, strategic decision to withdraw all his forces into the fortified cities around the harbour, Valletta, Floriana, and the three cities. There, protected by the greatest defensive works in Europe, the French army would wait. They had the grain stores, the ammunition, and the water cisterns. They assumed the rebellion would burn itself out, starved into submission by the coming winter. But the geopolitical tides were turning. Far to the east, in the waters of Aboukir Bay, Admiral Horatio Nelson had annihilated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. The lifeline between France and her Army of the Orient was severed. The Mediterranean, briefly a French lake, was once again contested waters. When news of the Maltese uprising reached Nelson, he saw an opportunity to tighten the noose around Napoleon's ambitions. He did not have an army to spare, but he had ships, and he had a captain of singular character. Alexander Ball. Captain Ball, commanding the HMS Alexander, was dispatched to Malta not as a conqueror, but as a lifeline. When his ships appeared off the coast in October 1798, the situation he found was dire. The Maltese insurgents were brave, certainly, but they were starving, disorganized, and riddled with factional rivalries. They held the countryside, but they had no heavy artillery to breach the walls of Valletta. They were a medieval peasant army trying to siege a modern fortress. Ball realized that a traditional naval blockade would not be enough. To take Malta, the pressure had to be applied from both the sea and the land. In a move that defied standard naval protocol, Ball stepped off his quarterdeck and onto the rocky shore. He established a beachhead, not with a massive invasion force, but with a handful of Royal Marines and a few cannon dragged from his ships. This was the beginning of the impossible defence, or rather, the impossible siege. A British naval captain was now effectively a general of a foreign revolutionary army. His mission was to unite the squabbling village leaders, organise a logistical system to feed thousands of hungry mouths, and maintain a perimeter around the French fortifications. He had to convince the Maltese that the British were not merely new occupiers, but partners in liberation. Ball established his headquarters in a modest house in the village of San Anton, far from the comfort of his ship's cabin. He walked the lines, spoke with the peasant soldiers, and assessed the formidable enemy facing them. Vaubois had 4,000 well-fed, well-armed regulars behind impregnable stone. Ball had a starving rabble and a few hundred Marines behind loose rubble walls. The stage was set for a grinding war of attrition, where the weapon of choice would not be the bayonet, but the sheer will to endure. The winter of 1798 settled over the island, not with snow, but with a biting, damp chill that seeped into the bones of the besiegers. The campaign had transformed into a surreal stagnation. On one side stood the massive geometrical perfection of the letter's fortifications, manned by General Vaubois and his professional soldiers. On the other lay the rugged, wind-swept countryside, patrolled by Captain Bull's ragtag army of farmers, priests, and exhausted marines. It was a siege defined not by grand assaults, but by the slow, agonizing erosion of hope. Captain Bull faced a challenge that would have broken a lesser commander. His army was a collection of village militias, each loyal to their own parish leaders, often suspicious of their neighbours, and entirely ignorant of military discipline. They lacked uniforms, shoes, and, most critically, gunpowder. Bull, however, possessed a genius for adaptation. He established a national congress, giving the Maltese leaders a voice and a stake in the war effort. He didn't command from a distance. He lived among them, sharing their meagre rations and listening to their grievances. Slowly, the British captain became known simply as the father of the Maltese. Under his guidance, the countryside was transformed into a fortress of its own. The Maltese farmers, masters of stonemasonry, utilised the ubiquitous limestone of their island to construct a network of batteries and redoubts. The dry stone walls that divided the fields, Hetan Tassegir, became ready-made breastworks for snipers. Every farmhouse became a lookout post, every church tower a signal station. The French, accustomed to the open battles of the continent, found themselves trapped in a hostile labyrinth. Any attempt to sortie from the gates to forage for food was met with a hail of lead from invisible enemies hidden among the rocks. But courage could not fill empty stomachs. As the months dragged on into 1799, the spectre of famine began to stalk the besiegers as relentlessly as the besieged. Malta, a barren rock with little natural soil, relied almost entirely on imported grain. With the island in chaos and trade disrupted, the granaries in the countryside were empty. The Maltese population, swollen by refugees fleeing the harbour cities, faced starvation. Bull wrote desperate letters to Nelson and the British government, pleading for supplies. When official funds were slow to arrive, he did the unthinkable for a career officer. He mortgaged his own future. Bull took out personal loans, pledging his own modest fortune to purchase grain from Sicily to feed the Maltese people. It was an act of personal sacrifice that cemented the bond between the islanders and the Royal Navy. They were starving together, fighting together, and dying together. Inside the walls of Valletta, the situation was descending into a different kind of hell. General Vaubois maintained strict discipline, but he could not command the rats to stop eating the grain stores. Nor could he stop the spread of disease. Scurvy and night blindness began to ravage the French ranks. The soldiers, elite veterans of the Italian campaigns, were reduced to brewing soup from boiled grass and slaughtering the city's cats and dogs for meat. The glorious vision of a French Mediterranean empire was dissolving into a grim, daily struggle for a crust of bread. Despite the misery, the French defence remained formidable. Vaubois was counting on the arrival of the French fleet to break the blockade. He knew that Bull's forces had no heavy siege guns capable of breaching the main walls. The French artillery, positioned high on the cavaliers, dominated the approaches. Whenever the Maltese grew too bold, the French guns would roar, shattering the silence and reminding the insurgents of the lethal power trapped within the city. The stalemate bred a unique form of psychological warfare. Bull utilised the prowess of the Maltese skirmishers to harass the French constantly, denying them sleep and crushing their morale. At night, the darkness was punctuated by the flash of muskets and the screams of sentries picked off on the ramparts. The French, isolated and surrounded by a population that despised them, began to feel the weight of their confinement. They were prisoners in their own conquest, guarding a stone cage while the world outside slowly tightened its grip. The siege had become a contest of endurance, a test of which side would crumble first under the weight of hunger and despair. While Captain Bull and his ragged army held the line on the rocky slopes, the true mechanism of victory was grinding into motion out on the open water. The siege of Malta was not merely a local insurrection. It was the focal point of a grand maritime strategy. The Royal Navy, commanded by the strategic brilliance of Lord Nelson from his base in Sicily, had drawn an iron circle around the island. This was the blockade, a silent, suffocating weapon that killed slowly but with absolute certainty. For the French garrison trapped inside Valletta, the sea was their only hope. They looked to the horizon daily, praying for the silhouette of a relief convoy from Toulon or Marseille. But what they saw, day after day, were the white ensigns of British warships. The squadron, a rotation of frigates and ships of the line, patrolled the approaches with relentless vigilance. They battled the notorious Mediterranean winter gales, risking shipwreck on the jagged coast, to ensure that not a bushel of wheat nor a keg of powder reached the enemy. The effectiveness of this naval stranglehold was tested in the spring of 1800. Desperation inside Valletta had reached a fever pitch. General Vaubois, watching his soldiers waste away and his ammunition stocks dwindle, played his final card. The Guillaume Tell, a massive 80-gun ship of the line and the last survivor of the French disaster at the Battle of the Nile, was anchored in the Grand Harbour. It was a symbol of French naval might, but now it was a prisoner. Vaubois ordered the ship to break the blockade under the cover of darkness, to race for France and return with reinforcements. On the night of March 30th, 1800, the Guillaume Tell slipped its moorings. A strong gale was blowing from the south, masking the sound of her departure. For a moment, it seemed the giant ship might escape into the open Mediterranean, but the eyes of the British blockade were sharp. The frigate HMS Penelope, commanded by the dashing Captain Henry Blackwood, spotted the fleeing giant. What followed was a masterclass in naval pursuit. The Penelope, dwarfed by the French battleship, did not retreat. Instead, Blackwood engaged in a running battle through the night, using his ship's speed to rake the stern of the Guillaume Tell repeatedly, shredding her sails and slowing her down. By dawn, the heavy hitters of the blockade squadron, the HMS Lion and the HMS Foudroyant, had caught up. The ensuing battle was ferocious. The French fought with the courage of the damned, their ship reduced to a dismasted, splintered hulk before finally striking her colours. The capture of the Guillaume Tell was more than a naval victory. It was the death knell for the French garrison. The ship was towed back towards Sicily, but the news of its loss filtered back to Valletta. The psychological impact was devastating. The message was clear: nothing gets out and nothing gets in. The blockade was not a sieve, it was a wall. Back on land, the synergy between the British Navy and the Maltese insurgents was now perfected. The blockade forced the French to look inward for resources, but the Maltese militia denied them every scrap of the island's produce. Captain Ball's impossible defence had matured into a sophisticated containment operation. The Maltese, once terrified of the French bayonets, now controlled the night. They intercepted messages, ambushed foraging parties, and maintained a vigil that meant the French soldiers could never lower their guard. The squeeze was total. Inside the Baroque palaces of Valletta, the glitter of the loot taken from the churches mocked the starving soldiers. Gold could not be eaten. Firewood had run out, forcing the garrison to break up merchant ships and doors for fuel. The rats that had once plagued the city were now hunted to extinction for food. The civilian population trapped inside the city with the French, numbering in the tens of thousands, suffered even worse fates, dying quietly in their homes as the military requisitioned what little food remained. General Vaubois was a man of logic. He looked at his maps and saw the reality. The British controlled the sea. The Maltese controlled the land. His army was undefeated in open battle, yet they were being defeated by the passage of time. The iron noose had tightened to the point of asphyxiation. The only question that remained was how long the pride of the French Republic could endure the gnawing pain of an empty belly before the inevitable collapse. As the spring of 1800 bled into summer, the Mediterranean sun returned with a vengeance, turning the limestone fortress of Valletta into a kiln. For the besieged French garrison, the return of the heat brought a new wave of torment. The cisterns, reliant on winter rains, began to run low. The stagnant air in the overcrowded city, thick with the stench of unburied refuse and sickness, became a breeding ground for typhus and dysentery. The iron noose of the blockade had done its work. Now, the elements were moving in for the kill. Inside the walls, the illusion of military order was crumbling. General Vaubois, a commander of immense fortitude, watched his regiments dissolve before his eyes. These were the soldiers who had conquered Italy, the veterans of the Army of the Orient, now reduced to skeletal figures in tattered uniforms. They leaned against the ramparts they were too weak to patrol, their eyes scanning the empty horizon for a tricolour sail that never came. The daily ration had been reduced to a few ounces of bread, made from a grotesque mixture of flour, bran, and crushed starch. Even the rats were gone. In a desperate bid to extend their supplies, Vaubois made the heart-wrenching decision to expel the useless mouths from the city. Hundreds of Maltese civilians, women, children, and the elderly who had been trapped inside during the initial retreat were pushed out of the gates. They stumbled into the no-man's land between the French walls and the British lines, caught between the occupiers who starved them and the liberators who could not feed them. It was a humanitarian tragedy that underscored the brutality of the siege. Captain Ball, witnessing the misery, did what he could to absorb these refugees into the starving villages, further stretching his own breaking logistics. Yet, as the French withered, the British position finally hardened into a conventional military force. For nearly 2 years, Captain Ball had held the island with nothing but charisma, Marines, and Maltese irregulars. Now, London finally recognised the strategic prize within their grasp. British Army regulars began to arrive to reinforce the siege. Brigadier General Thomas Graham and later Major General Henry Piggott landed with fresh troops, heavy artillery, and the rigid discipline of the professional army. The arrival of the army brought a shift in the command dynamic. The impossible defence had been sustained by the unique, almost familial bond between Captain Ball and the Maltese people. The new army commanders, however, viewed the Maltese militia with the disdain typical of the era, seeing them not as the stalwart allies who had held the line for 20 months, but as an undisciplined rabble. Tensions flared. It was Ball who once again acted as the bridge, smoothing over insults and ensuring that the fragile coalition did not fracture at the 11th hour. He argued fiercely that it was the Maltese who had bled for every inch of the countryside, and it was their endurance that had bought the time for the army to arrive. By August 1800, the situation inside Valletta had passed from desperate to apocalyptic. The death rate among the French garrison soared to over 100 men a day. The hospitals were overflowing charnel houses. Morale collapsed completely when news filtered through the blockade that the French army in Egypt was crumbling and that Napoleon, now First Consul of France, had no ships to spare for a lost cause in the middle of the Mediterranean. They were abandoned. Vaubois summoned his council of war on the 2nd of September. There was no debate to be had. His duty to the Republic was to hold the fortress until it was no longer militarily possible. That moment had arrived. They had no food, no medicine, and no hope. To continue would not be soldiering, it would be mass suicide. The proud general, who had defied the British Empire for 2 years, sat down to draft the terms of capitulation. The silence that fell over the Grand Harbour was heavy. The guns, which had exchanged fire sporadically for 700 days, grew cold. On the ridgelines, the Maltese insurgents, their clothes ragged and their faces gaunt from years of hardship, watched the walls. They had waited through the scorching summers and the damp winters. They had seen their homes destroyed and their fields lay fallow. But they had held on. The impossible defence was over. The endgame had begun. On the morning of September 4th, 1800, a hush descended over the battered ramparts of Valletta. The roar of cannon fire, the crack of musketry, and the shouts of the sentries were replaced by a singular, stark image rising above the fortifications, a white flag. It flapped lazily in the stifling heat, a symbol of defeat for the French Republic and a signal of deliverance for the island. The siege, which had ground on for 2 years, was finally at an end. Major General Henry Pigot, representing the British Army, and Captain George Martin of the Royal Navy, representing the fleet, accepted the call for parley. The negotiations were conducted with the stiff formality of 18th century warfare, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the starving soldiers on both sides. General Vaubois, though defeated by hunger, negotiated with the pride of a man who knew he had done his duty to the utmost. He demanded and received the honours of war. The French garrison would not be marched off to prison hulks in England. Instead, they would be repatriated to France on the condition that they would not take up arms against Britain until formally exchanged. The surrender was signed on September 5th. The terms were generous to the French, acknowledging their tenacious defence, but they contained a bitter pill for the Maltese. The text of the capitulation was strictly between the British commanders and the French general. The Maltese insurgents, the men who had risen first, who had died on the barricades, and whose families had starved to support the siege, were not signatories. Captain Ball, the father of the Maltese, was present, but the glory of the moment was seized by the newly arrived army generals. It was a foreshadowing of the colonial relationship that was to come, a victory won by the people, but claimed by the empire. When the gates of Valletta finally swung open, the British troops who marched in were greeted by a scene from a nightmare. The once glorious city of the knights was a graveyard. The streets were silent, save for the weak cheers of the few surviving civilians. The French soldiers who marched out to lay down their arms were walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging loosely on emaciated frames. Many were too weak to walk and had to be supported by their comrades. They had eaten the horses, the mules, the dogs, the cats, and finally, the rats. Yet they marched with their heads high, drums beating, a spectral parade of the Grand Army. As the French tricolour was lowered from the flagstaff of Fort St. Elmo, the Union Jack was hoisted in its place. The sight of the British flag snapping in the wind over the Grand Harbour signalled a tectonic shift in the balance of power. Britain had not just won an island, they had acquired the most formidable fortress in the world. They now possessed the deep water harbour, the vast dockyards, and the impregnable walls that would allow the Royal Navy to project power into every corner of the Mediterranean. For the Maltese, the moment was bittersweet. They rushed into the city, seeking loved ones and reclaiming their homes, only to find them stripped and broken. They had liberated their country, but they had not regained their independence. They had traded the knights for the French, and now the French for the British. However, in the figure of Alexander Ball, they saw a protector. They petitioned the King of Great Britain to take them under his protection, preferring the stability of the naval superpower to the chaos of the past 2 years. The impossible defence had succeeded. A single British ship, a handful of Marines, and a determined population had defied the might of Napoleon. They had turned a quick French conquest into a trap and then into a tomb. The keys to the kingdom were now in British hands, and they would not let them go for another 164 years. The lock of the Mediterranean was secure. The fall of Valletta in September 1800 was more than a changing of the guard. It was a pivot point in global history. When the news reached Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte, now firmly established as the first consul, understood the magnitude of the loss. His dream of an Eastern Empire, of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great to the banks of the Indus, had evaporated. Without Malta, the Mediterranean could never be a French lake. The British Royal Navy had driven a wedge into his grand strategy, a wedge made of limestone and defended by peasants. However, the peace that followed was fragile. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802, intended to bring a pause to the hostilities between Britain and France, contained a specific clause regarding the island. Britain was to evacuate Malta and return it to the Order of St. John. But the British government, having now tasted the strategic advantage of the Grand Harbour, hesitated. They realised that giving up the island was tantamount to handing the keys of the Mediterranean back to Napoleon. The refusal of Britain to leave Malta became the primary casus belli for the resumption of war in 1803. The Napoleonic Wars, which would ravage Europe for another decade, were reignited, in no small part, over the question of who owned this single, barren rock. For Captain Alexander Ball, the victory was personal. He did not sail away to seek new glory in the Atlantic. He remained, appointed as the first civil commissioner of Malta. He had come as a warrior, but he stayed as an administrator and a friend. He worked tirelessly to restore the island's economy, to respect the Maltese laws and religion, and to advocate for the people against the distant bureaucracy in London. When he died in Malta in 1809, he was buried there, not in an English churchyard, but in the soil he had helped liberate. To this day, a monument in the Lower Baraka Gardens overlooks the harbour entrance, a testament to the unique bond between the British sailor and the islanders who called him Father. The union, forged in the fires of the blockade, transformed Malta. It became the headquarters of the British Mediterranean Fleet, a bustling hub of trade, coaling, and repair that projected British power for over a century and a half. The island that had been an impossible defence in 1798 became the nurse of the Mediterranean during the First World War and the unsinkable aircraft carrier during the Second. The resilience shown by the Maltese militia against the French was echoed in the heroism of their descendants during the Luftwaffe Blitz of the 1940s. The George Cross, awarded to the entire island in 1942, shares a spiritual lineage with the muskets and rubble walls of Captain Ball's peasant army. Looking back, the events of 1798 to 1800 offer a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The French had the superior army, the defensive terrain, and the military reputation. Yet, they were defeated by a combination of naval strangulation and popular insurgency. It proved that in the era of empires, a fortress is only as strong as its supply lines, and an occupier is only as secure as the population allows them to be. The impossible defense was not a miracle. It was the triumph of logistics, adaptability, and the enduring human spirit. Today, the Grand Harbour is quiet. The great ships of the line are gone, replaced by cruise liners and super yachts. The Union Jack no longer flies over St. Elmo. Independent Malta has charted its own course since 1964. But the ghosts of the siege remain. They are in the bullet-scarred walls of the Cottonera lines, in the statues of the village squares, and in the very identity of the nation. It was a brief, violent window in time where a British captain and a Maltese farmer stood shoulder to shoulder, looked at the might of Napoleon's empire, and said, "No further." If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most pivotal yet overlooked campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did Britain betray the Maltese by keeping the island, or was it a strategic necessity? I read every comment, and for more documentaries on the Redcoat era and the military history of the British Empire, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing. Until next time.